Welcome to the Sanditen Kaiser Holocaust Center, honoring Mildred and Julius Sanditen and Herman and Kate Kaiser, located at the Sherwin Museum of Jewish Art. Welcome to the entrance of the Holocaust Center. This is our grand hall. Our first example of hate is a KKK robe from Tulsa that stands in front of a mural of the devastation caused by the 1921 Greenwood Race Massacre that is commemorating 100 years in 2021. Unfortunately, the KKK is still alive and functioning in the U.S. today. On the TV screen, you'll see Eva Unterman, who's a Holocaust survivor and has dedicated half of her life to Holocaust education in Tulsa. As we go through the Holocaust Center, you'll see survivors who relocated to Oklahoma that are sharing their stories and lives of the Holocaust. In the Grand Hall, you'll see artifacts of people's items, household goods, and items that were personal effects that represent post-World War I family possessions that were donated to the museum. We wanted to welcome you into their homes to share their stories of what happened and show examples of hate and discrimination that are still present today. Here you can see our sitting area, a typical home of anybody in Europe after World War I. Jews fought in World War I for Germany. They were citizens. And as you see, this is a noted Jewish veterans pin in the frame. They were proud of being German, they were proud of their citizenship, and proud of being Jewish. They were not always victims. As we pass by the wall, you'll see a quote from Pastor Niemöller, one of the founders of the Confessing Church, who was sent to the concentration camps for his opposition to Nazis. His poem is a nod to the consequences of being a bystander. First they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist. I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. As we continue, we see the history of anti-Semitism, or hatred of Jews, depicted. It shows the timeline of pre-Christianity, religious, the Nazi effect, racial discrimination, and current anti-Semitism, including the desecration of Jewish tombstones in Tulsa's cemetery in 1990. On the wall, you'll see a map of the Jewish population in Europe in 1933. Note the number of Jews in Europe before Hitler came to power. The number will change drastically, as you see at the end of the Holocaust Center. This sets the stage and awareness of populations before the Holocaust. After World War I, Germany was a democracy. There were numerous political parties, and there were votes and elections to have those parties in office. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and its limitations on Germany because of World War I were set in place. Nazis started gaining power, and they could not be ignored. The president of Germany, von Hindenburg, made Hitler the chancellor, thinking that this would control him and the Nazi party. In 1933, the parliament building, the Reichstag, was burnt down. Hitler blamed the communists and declared martial law in Germany. Hitler was soon voted in democratically by the people, and not without the aid of propaganda, though. It all begins with words. In 1933, after the burning of the Parliament building, Hitler declared a boycott on Jewish businesses. Although it was partially successful, Germans still wanted to use the different Jewish businesses like tailors, accountants, and bakers, so Hitler slightly backed off. Although this continued, there were book burnings, led by German college students, members of the SA and Hitler Youth, that burned 25,000, quote, un-German, end quote, books, those written by Jewish authors and anyone who defied the German beliefs in Berlin. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were enacted. Around the corner, we saw Jewish citizens who fought for Germany, but now the Nuremberg Laws took that citizenship away. The Nuremberg Laws defined who was a Jew by their genealogy. Jewish was a religion, but they were making it a race and discriminating based on that race. Many German Jews were totally assimilated. They were Germans first and Jews second, but that did not matter according to the Nuremberg Laws. Changing the atmosphere, people became uncomfortable. You'll see a large wall of propaganda. Nazis were masters of propaganda and advertising to get their beliefs and lies out to the public for people to believe. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, used radio broadcasts, children's book, propaganda posters, movies, and unflattering caricatures of Jews, which can be seen on this display. His motto was, "The bigger lie, the more it will be believed." The artifacts that you see on the ground in this display case are authentic and were donated by survivors, soldiers, and families donated to the museum for educational purposes. The cases you see are on the floor and haphazardly displayed because we want you to understand that these items and this propaganda are below you and beneath you. As we talk about Nazi society, there are two components that we focus on in the exhibit. First is Hitler Youth. Many of the boys from 10 to 17 were recruited for Hitler Youth, chosen for their, quote, Aryan, end quote, looks, blonde hair and blue eyes. If one didn't fit the look, they were disregarded. Note the poster, which represents this perfect look. Also, in this society was the Motherhood Award. An award was given to mothers to have as many children as they could and were given these medals depending on how many children they had of this Aryan nation. Gold, silver, and bronze medals were awarded depending on the number of children that were born. The pins were given to the Women's Society, which taught young women to serve their man by propagating and promoting the Nazi Party ideals. In 1936, the Olympics came to Germany. The purpose of the Olympics was to show the world that Nazis were not mistreating the Jews or anybody else. It welcomed the world in to show them how perfect Germany was. All Jewish restrictions were suspended during those games. Restrictions resumed when the eyes of the world were finally gone. Germany took home 89 medals, but the U.S. came in second with 56 as track star Jesse Owens was black and won 4 gold medals, discouraging Hitler's perfect nation. It became law soon after that Jews were required to wear yellow Stars of David on their outfits when out in public. Their passports were also stamped with large J's to identify them as Jews. These identifying items allowed people to harass Jews or even worse. The United States, President Roosevelt called for the Avion Conference. This invited 32 countries into France to talk about the immigration of Jews out of Europe. Roosevelt did not attend, but sent Mildred Taylor, a businessman, in his place. The purpose of this meeting was to see if any countries would take the Jews. Of the 32, only the Dominican Republic agreed to take in any Jew immigrants. This proved their leader's reputation after the government's massacre of black Haitians in 1937, and to bring white wealth into his country. The message to Nazi Germany, though, was that nobody wanted the Jews and nobody cared. The Torah that you see on display is from Czechoslovakia. This Torah and many other religious artifacts were stolen from synagogues during Kristallnacht. Hitler and the Nazi Party planned on destroying these artifacts to take away the faith of the Jewish people. These artifacts were taken from Nazis and stored until educational institutes were able to display them and educate what happened in the Holocaust, like this one here. The bench you see behind you is on display and shows how the segregation of Jews happened in Germany. It has on there in German, only for Jews, and Jews were only allowed to sit on these benches. As you see from the photograph, a woman is sitting on the bench and she is hiding her face as she is a Jew and this is the only place that she can sit. These laws were similar to the Jim Crow laws in the United States, where African Americans were only able to use certain facilities that were marked for them. Kristallnacht happened November 9th and 10th in 1938. This was a pogrom, an act of violence that destroyed over 200 synagogues, 7,500 Jewish businesses, countless homes, and had 30,000 men arrested while 91 were killed. Jewish prisoners were released if they had begun the process of immigrating out of Germany. The insurance claims for the Jewish businesses were confiscated by the Nazis, and the Jews actually had to pay Nazis over $400 million in damages for their own businesses. The glass sculpture created by Tracy and Rick Bewley of Oklahoma City has over 250 pieces of glass and symbolized the stained glass windows that were damaged and destroyed in the synagogues. The photo on the back wall shows one of these synagogues in its destroyed state. The pew that you see on the floor is from a Houston synagogue here in the United States with prayer books, prayer shawls, bricks, and other damages to display the chaos that happened on these nights. The glass sculpture has over 250 pieces of glass to symbolize the stained glass windows of damaged and destroyed synagogues that night. This is the ghetto section. Jews had lost their citizenship, endured Kristallnacht, and everything was taken from them, but they were still there. Nazis knew they needed a different approach to force Jews into the worst area of the city and hoped that the deplorable conditions would lead them to death. There were over 1,000 ghettos in Nazi-occupied Europe. Jewish leaders were appointed to manage the ghettos and to do the Nazis' dirty work while preparing the deportation list. Some ghettos were sealed, while others were open for Jews to come and go. The Warsaw Ghetto became the most famous. It was the largest and the site of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where Jewish fighters held off Nazis for a little over a month with smuggled weapons. The overcrowding, lack of sanitation, starvation, and disease prevented residents from physically resisting the ghettos. The resistance did happen in other forms: teaching children and practicing one's faiths in secret, underground newspapers, smuggling food, escape attempts, and even playing music. Some of these acts were punishable by death. One person in the ghetto said, quote, "Every day of the Holocaust, Jewish people resisted the Nazis, some by fighting with guns, and many of us just by not losing hope and surviving day by day." This photograph is remembered by Eva Unterman, the Holocaust survivor we talked about earlier. One day when she was in a bookstore in Michigan at the bargain book bin, she looked through a book of the Diary of David Sharakowiak. Thumbing through the book, she came across the picture you see and recognized that the woman on the right, holding the bundle, was her mother. Eva said, "I almost passed out." The picture was taken in early 1940. People were still healthy looking, clothes and shoes were in good shape, and Eva promptly bought every copy of the book in the store. This is the only picture Eva has of her mother in the Lotz ghetto. As you see on display, different armbands were worn by various groups of people living and working in the different ghettos. Why didn't the Jews leave? The Nazis' initial plan was to make life hard for Jews so they would leave, but the world wasn't open for immigrants. So the Jews were put into ghettos to die. Neither worked, so the Nazis needed another plan. This wall shows the voyage of the St. Louis. There were 937 passengers, mostly Jews, that had applied for U.S. visas and planned to stay in Cuba until their number came up. But when they arrived at Cuba, they refused to let them enter, as did the United States. The Jewish organization secured entry passes for passengers eventually to Great Britain, Netherlands, Belgium, and France, but unfortunately, 254 of the passengers were killed during the Holocaust. The SS and local police were assigned to come in after the German troops had conquered an area, and they became the mobile killing squads. 1/3 of the Jewish Holocaust victims were killed by these mobile killing squads. These mobile squads shot Jews one by one at the mass grave's edge. The victims were then buried in the mass graves that they had often been forced to dig themselves. Other techniques these mobile squads used was to put their victims in the back of vans and use the exhaust pipes to choke them, and the victims would die within 15 to 20 minutes. A code name for systematic, deliberate, and physical annihilation of European Jews. The plan of action had already been decided by the highest-ranking Nazi officials attending the Wannsee Conference in 1942. 15 people attended, 6 high-ranking military officers, and 9 state agency representatives. Engineers, architects, chemists, all were involved in carrying out the efficiency to kill the Jews. The solution was Zyklon B poison. Boxcars were vital in transporting the victims to work in the concentration camps. Trips often took days or even weeks. Passengers were crammed in with standing room only with little food, water, and only a bucket to provide for a toilet. Upon arrival, prisoners were separated by a selection committee, with healthy men and women to one side, handicapped, mothers of babies, and elderlies also. In killing camps, it often took 20 minutes from selection to gas chambers for those who were not chosen to work. Before we immerse you into the concentration camp environment, please look across the balcony as you see in the great hall downstairs the lives and items of these same free Jewish families. Up here you see those families are now behind barbed wire. Not only Jews were persecuted and killed. Originally, concentration camps were for political opponents of the Nazis. Other victims were called, quote, enemies of the state, end quote, and included political, criminal, antisocial, homosexual, immigrants, and Jehovah's Witnesses. Here are the markings that the prisoners wore in the camps with different shades and colors of triangles and patches. If you were Jewish and one of the other groups, a yellow triangle was added to your badge. In the camps, you received about 200 calories per day that were provided with stale bread, watery soup, and fake coffee in the camp. The prisoner's most important possession was a bowl. If you had no bowl, you would get no food and you would starve. Prisoners often wore the bowls around their neck and used it as a pillow to prevent them from being stolen. If you lost or your spoon was stolen, you'd have to drink your soup like a dog. Shoes were also important in the survival, especially during a death march. Survivor Gerda Klein credits her survival during a 350-mile death march to her ski boots that her father insisted she take with her when she was deported. Often people who visit the museum are only familiar with Anne Frank's story. 8 people, including Anne Frank's family, the Van Pels, and the Fritz Pfeiffer, lived for over 2 years from 1942 to 1944 in the attic of her father's business in Amsterdam. During the day, they had to stay completely quiet. They couldn't flush toilets, walk around, or even wear shoes, and could only move around at night after the employees had left. After being denounced, they were eventually sent to Auschwitz, then Bergen-Belsen, where Anne, her sister Margot, and her mother died. Her father, Otto Frank, the only family member to survive, was responsible for sharing Anne's diary with the world. In our exhibit, you see a recreation of the bookcase that hid the stairs to Anne's hiding place. You also see Pull, which gives you the question whether you want to reveal this entrance or not. It's your choice. You will pull and risk exposing Anne's hiding place, or you would choose not to let your curiosity dominate your good sense and protect those in hiding. Instead of concentrating on the war against the Allies, which they were losing, the Nazis focused on their other goal of eliminating Jews. With liberation looming, death marches forced many prisoners to walk hundreds of miles into the interior of Germany. Nazis were trying to cover up their crimes by leaving no living prisoner behind as evidence. The majority did not survive. Here you can see a correlation with the death marches and our own Trail of Tears into the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. Gerda Weissman survived a 350-mile death march, was liberated by American troops. Eva Unterman endured an 11-day death march to Terezin, where she and her parents were liberated by Soviets. Liberation came with various Soviet and U.S. and allies who came into the concentration camps to liberate those that were still there. Emblems worn by various divisions of the U.S. Army and others are represented in our display case. Oklahoma's own 45th Division liberated Dachau concentration camp. General Dwight Eisenhower gave a quote in 1945. Quote, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in the position to give first-hand evidence of what occurred." The picture on the wall depicts 3 sisters who were in the Auschwitz concentration camp. Note the numbers are in sequence as the sisters were deported together. Auschwitz camp was the only place prisoners received these tattoos. Here on the wall we show you the Jewish population of 1950. Before the exhibit, we showed you the population in 1933, and we point out the countries that had the greatest losses. Over 6 million Jews were killed, and researchers say a number could be up to 8 million. Although very few, there were those who helped the Jews with no material or monetary benefit expected. Irina Sendler helped over 2,600 children from the Warsaw Ghetto, smuggling them out and placing them with non-Jewish families, which saved their lives. Oskar Schindler saved 1,200 Jews by employing them in his factories. All righteous among the nations have a tree planted or a plaque hung in Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum complex in Israel. The sculpture you see is titled Yizkor, meaning May God Remember. The chimneys represent 6 million Jews killed. The burnt metal represents bodies burnt. Barbed wire represents the concentration camps. Of the 6 million Jews killed, 1.5 million were children. For 6 years, each student that came to the museum got a stone with the name and the age of a child that was killed during the Holocaust. These students were asked to decorate these stones in celebration and commemoration of their lives. The Kinderstone statues contain the decorative stones and contain about 400 to 500 stones. These statues are dedicated to the memory of Harold Stein and Susan Fenster, two devoted supporters of the Holocaust Center and Holocaust education who passed away in June of 2019. In 1948, the creation of the State of Israel occurred. Portraits of the most famous and important people involved in this you see above: David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, and Moshe Dayan. Here you also see the Israeli Declaration of Independence that states their freedom and independence. This brief tour is just a small portion of the new Holocaust Center, and we hope you and your families come and learn even more about the Holocaust and what happened in Europe.